I would like to be here, energetically supporting this piece of legislation and enthusiastically supporting it. And unfortunately, I can't, because I believe it's woefully inadequate. The past 10 years, we've seen 8 different pieces of legislation on this topic. I had one myself in 2012, which was debated in this House. There was one from Fianna Fáil, from Sinn Féin, the Greens, Labour and Fine Gael. So it's been right across the political spectrum. There has been legislation presented here which pretty much covers the entire population. It's taken 10 years of bills, reports, hearings, consultations, drafts, legislative scrutiny to get where we are now. And all the time, the overwhelming evidence presented was that whatever law emerged needed to be strong in order that we do change behaviour and that we actually bring people with us. And it's not all bad news either. We need to have balance. Over the next 10 years, over those 10 years, many other countries, despite what was said, and it was said here a couple of weeks ago when we had a debate on the committee report, said that we were almost leading the way in Europe. But the UK, Scotland, France, Denmark, Sweden and Finland have one thing in common. They've all adopted legislation that is much stronger than what we're presented with, and they all have targets set in domestic law. Unfortunately, and critically in my view, this piece of legislation doesn't contain that. It's amazing that for legislation that has the support of politicians right across the spectrum, that it appears that narrow sectoral interests seem to have had a more impact in terms of the framing of this legislation. And I hope it can be changed at committee level. It's an indictment that the Parliament, over the last 10 years, that we failed to respond to one of the biggest challenges of our times. It's, as has been said already, it's not just for this generation, it's most definitely for the future generations. And like the planet will survive, it's the amount of people on the planet and the conditions they will survive in that we're talking about. As a member of the Oireachtas Environment Committee, we took a fairly pragmatic view in terms of putting our report together. And I've got to say, the culture in terms of the debate, the people who we brought in relation to that report was actually very good, and it was very inclusive of all views. And the report was a very measured report. I would have liked it to go way further, but a lot of us were happy to go with the middle ground because we felt that it had a decent chance of making some of the suggestions and recommendations would make it into the law, and unfortunately some of the more serious ones haven't. For example, we dropped outright targets in favour of a definition of the kind of low carbon economy we want to arrive at, one which near zero emissions in transport, energy and buildings and carbon neutrality in agriculture was how we framed it. Amazingly, it didn't. That compromise didn't make it into this legislation, and that's hugely disappointing. Indeed, now Minister Kevin Humphreys constantly talked about a model when it came to the independence of the Expert Advisory Council. He talked about the need for a model like the Fiscal Advisory Council, and I think we thought that was a very good idea, and he was constantly harping on about it. That hasn't been evident in how this has been framed in terms of the independence, or possibly the lack of any independence, of the Expert Advisory Council. It's vitally important that the body which monitors our efforts under this bill has the power to hold the government to account. If departments don't fear consequences, I think that it won't be central to framing of legislation and policy options into the future. So I think that's critically important, that independence is elevated when it comes to the committee stage of this legislation, and I would hope that you will take that on board. The Environmental Protection Agency has already predicted that even if the most extreme mitigating measures were adopted today, we will still fail to achieve our present 2020 emission reduction targets. The 2030 EU framework target, which the bill is based around, is twice the 2020 targets, 40% of a reduction on the 1990 emissions. Now, when you start looking at where the sectoral plans are included in this, we're not even going to have them until 2017. We're not going to know what the outcome of those are until 2022-23. So we'll only have 7 years. If we're off target, we'll only have 7 years to go back on target. And, you know, that is going to become an impossibility for people, even just a short time into the future. That is a major problem. The sectoral plans, I've got some replies to parliamentary questions from Transport, for example, from your own department in relation to the sectoral plans. And the Transport one, to be perfectly honest with you, it doesn't look like it's even been considered in advance of the sectoral plans being put in place, the kind of investments that are going into transport. The built environment, there's a real opportunity there, maybe through the European Investment Fund in terms of retrofitting. And indeed, when we look at the carbon fund, we don't have a carbon fund here. What we have is another means of collecting taxes. There has to be a relationship between the carbon fund and what people see for that carbon fund, if you're actually going to bring people along, if you're going to change people's attitudes. And that has to be seen as an opportunity, not as something that's going to be kind of imposed on top of people. And of course, the agriculture sector is probably our most challenging sector. And there's no doubt that we produce very good food, but there's things that could be done that could be mitigating at this stage, not waiting until the sectoral plan is produced. And I think that that's going to be one of the biggest failures of this, how you do it, really, and what our national as was said, this is how our national ambition is stated through the sectoral plans. Well, there's a lack of national ambition by virtue of the fact that we're going to be waiting until 2022 or 2023 before we even see where the difficulties are going to arise. And remember, we're not going to make 20%, and we have to get to 40% by 2030. And you can already predict that that is going to be an impossible task into the future. We could, a lot of us can look back and say, why didn't more people shout stop during the economic crash when you could predict that there was a building boom that was a bubble? We can predict in the same way if we don't take the kind of decisions now. We'll be looking back and saying, why didn't we do that then, when it was so clear that we had an obligation that we had signed up to, that we didn't put the nuts and bolts in place to actually deliver on a solution in a timely way. And this legislation misses the target by a very significant distance by virtue of the fact that it doesn't have things like independence in terms of the expert advisory council. It doesn't have the sectoral plans are pushed out into the future. I mean, we had recommended that it would be 12 months, no more than 12 months. It's now 24 months.
Normally the one.
And the lack of a definition is a huge difficulty in that without defining it, we are going to have a serious problem in actually doing something about something that doesn't even have a definition or an adequate definition. Minister, I hope you're going to be able to take a significant number of amendments at committee stage. We had a very good pre-legislative stage. If that's going to mean something, we have to see that coming through in the bill itself. And as I said, that was very much the middle ground. That was not, on the extreme end where you were trying to create a dialectic between the department and the committee. It was trying to be responsible about what could be delivered. And the real disappointment is that even that middle ground hasn't been taken on board. And I look forward to your comments at the end of this to more or less give us some sort of an indication of what is likely to be taken at committee stage. Thank you.
Deputy Joan Collins.